Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Makakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teachings, truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I kind of wanted to basically, discuss a situation that I experienced, and it's kind of related to a topic that one of my elders was just discussing. Basically, it touches upon First Corinthians, the 8th chapter, right? Basically, the title goes into taking care of your liberty. So one of my elders recently discussed this, and I wanted to touch on something, or rather like an experience that I had where it could have been a stumbling block for another brother, right? And that was a mistake ultimately that I made. And just to be basically, it's just a bit of an exhortation, learn from my mistake, right? So essentially, this lesson is going to be kind of surrounding the idea of basically being mindful, being considerate, and then being more aware in regards to, other brothers around you, right? Especially younger brothers, right? And I had a situation. As a matter of fact, let me read the context of what's being discussed here by the Apostle Paul, right? So this was recently a talking point that was done by one of my elders recently, and I kind of wanted to touch on this because I actually experienced this, and I kind of wanted to touch on it as well because I made that mistake, and not basically to learn from. This is a bit of just an exhortation to learn from my mistake, basically, right? I wanted to read this, so let me just read a little bit of this here, and then I'll kind of touch on it. I want to kind of go back and forth between the KJV. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 7, and basically going into meet the conscience, because we're all coming from different brothers come from different backgrounds, so on and so forth. So there are certain things, lawful things that we might enjoy, right? Not just eating in the physical sense, but also eating in the spiritual sense as well, but some things might actually can aggravate a brother's basically his demons, because there might be certain things that he might be trying to overcome within his own walk, within his own path. But basically certain things you might refrain from doing, being in the presence of that brother, right? So I want to read this just real quick. So it's basically just touching on eating, and not just in the physical sense, but also to drive the lesson home is basically to also understand the importance of considerations, being considerate, being mindful, and not being like completely like self-willed, so to speak, right? 1 Corinthians 8, verse 7. I'm going to read down a little bit. And it says, howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge, for some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But meat condemneth us not to the Most High, for neither, if we eat, are we the better, neither, if we eat not, are we the worse. But take heed, and here's really the point, take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak, right? So there might be certain, pleasures, you might enjoy. And again, this is not just limited to just food, right? Because, we understand we have a dietary law, of course, right? But, so-called Christians might use that as an opportunity to, basically eat whatever, right? we have grace, but it doesn't mean we negate the importance of the law. And I think Paul goes into that in Romans, right? So the point is, there might be things that, you might enjoy, as a brother, within your own personal, leisure time, so to speak. But, that thing, whatever that might be, it might cause basically offense to another brother, especially if you're, within that particular situation, within their space, so to speak. So, I was in a situation where, this happened to me, right? And, I was, I ended up buying, something, in the presence of, another brother, right? And, that thing, because of, the I guess you can say the world that, he came from, it would have caused offense, and most likely caused some offense, right? So, realizing in retrospect, after, reflecting, realizing that, that would have been a stumbling block to them, in terms of their walk, because that would have been something that aggravated, their demons, so to speak, because the demons might see that, so for example, let's just say it like this. Let me say it like this. Say, for example, you have a brother that was, he came from the military world, right? He's seen bloodshed. He's seen, people deleting themselves. He's seen, He's seen like a lot of gory, stuff. And I was the type of brother that maybe, let's just say I like, movies about World War II, World War One, and all this kind of stuff. And I said to the brother, okay, let's go watch this movie, and the movie is about that kind of military work. Him, it wouldn't be a good idea for me to watch that movie basically in his presence. Like I said before, this is not just simply speaking about eating in the physical sense. In this particular situation I had, it was eating in the physical sense, but it may not necessarily be that way. It might be just something that you might be into, right? That you gravitate to. But, in that being said, some of those things, it might aggravate, another brother's demons, depending on the type of world that he came from. So there probably would be certain discussions you wouldn't have with that particular brother, depending on what it is that might aggravate him. He might stay away from certain things. Like I said before about the types of movies, using the example I just, mentioned, okay, I might not discuss those kinds of movies, or I might not bring up this particular subject matter around this brother, because it might cause some aggravation, within his spirit in regards to this, in regards to something that I like to do. You know what I'm saying? So, that can be a stumbling block. This is verse 10. And it says, "For if any man see thee which has knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols?" Right? So, he might, see that, as okay, this is, okay for me, to do, right? He might see that as okay, this is, but that might, him delving into that, going back to the example I used about the watching those kinds of movies, if that is something that aggravates that brother, then, that might cause his conscience to weaken even more, right? So I'm saying this in a long-winded way, to just be mindful of the things, you might like. And again, this is not merely, speaking about food, right? It can be particular things that you might be into, but, you might not have certain discussions, or you might not, you might mention it maybe, but you might not do certain things in the presence of that brother, because you don't want his conscience to basically be weakened by you doing those things. And that was a mistake I made, right? I was in a situation and I made that mistake. In that situation, it specifically was about food. It involved food, right? But my after examination, and realized, okay, I should have not eaten that in the presence, what I'm saying, of that brother specifically. What I'm saying? So it's just really going back to the point about just being mindful of, of your brothers, right? And their conscience towards certain things, right? So, this is a world, we live in, where, you're not really taught to actually be mindful, humble yourself and be considerate. It's more about, me, type of mentality, the type of world that we live in, right? So, and, Yahushua really showed us basically the importance of, being considerate, and being mindful, of your brother, right? So, showed us a very servitude mindset, Anyways, I rambled on quite a bit, so let me get this in Sirach. Just bear with me 1 second. And again, I really hope this is, I really hope this is edifying. I'm kind of just all over the place with this. This is Sirach chapter 4, verse 2. And it says here, make not a hungry soul sorrowful, neither provoke a man in his distress, right? So in the situation, going back to, my own experience and my mistake, that situation would have provoked him, in distress, because seeing that would have aggravated certain, things that, he completely, cut off, that was a situation would have been like, okay, him seeing that, and in a weakened conscious state, it would have provoked him, not as opposed to encouraging him to do the right thing, right? So let me get the word here, distress, in the etymology here, and it says circumstance that causes anxiety or hardship. It says draw apart, hinder, compel, coerce. It says this is apart, and stringere means to draw, press together. So, he would have experienced, oh, there's more, hold on. It says anguish, grief, pain, or suffering of the body or mind, right? So, those kinds of things, those kinds of situations, it's just really more about being considerate, because you don't want to do something where it affects and aggravates some kind of distress or some kind of anguish, within, that brother's conscience, so to speak, right? Because, we're all in like a spiritual rehab where we're being more whole by overcoming a lot of these demons. And a lot of these things, we might what one brother might suffer from, it may not be the same thing as another brother, but sometimes those things are, we work to basically overcome those things, right? We're not looking to aggravate each other's demons, so to speak, right? We're not looking to provoke those particular demons, right? And if this is information and you have that knowledge, that about brothers, you operate more, basically you learn to operate more carefully, right? You learn to operate more what's the word I'm looking for? You learn to operate more considerate. You learn to kind of be more be more exhorting, if that makes sense. The scriptures say when you're converted, I think Yahushua said that actually, when you're converted, basically to strengthen thy brethren, right? We don't want to hinder, another brother's, or aggravate basically his demons, so to speak, by some of the actions we might do because we want to fulfill something within our own flesh. We want to eat something, whether it's physically or in another sense. We want to eat something, and then that thing causes another brother's conscience to weaken, right? So really it's just going back to the point about being considerate and being just being mindful as well. I made that mistake, so I'm just sharing this as a lesson, not to do what I did. Right? As a matter of fact, let me get this quick one in Sirach as well. Because I'm sure there's other brothers that have maybe made that mistake, not willingly, but, after examination, you realize, oh man, that could have caused a brother to fall like that. This is Sirach 21:1, and it says, "My son, hast thou sinned? Do so no more, and ask pardon for thy former sins." Because this is we make mistakes, right? But just through self-examination, you learn, okay, this is not something. I just gotta be more mindful and be more considerate, and just being on more understanding or in regards to certain talking points, or it could be or certain kinds of food, if we were talking about food specifically, right? So let me go to Colossians. This is Colossians 3 verse 12, and it says, "Put on therefore as the elect of the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, and long suffering," right? So it's really more about just having a humbleness of mind rather than thinking about yourself, right? You kind of put yourself in a position where you don't you think about the welfare of the brother, right? You don't you're not just in a mindset where you constantly think about yourself all the time, right? So it's just really about maintaining a certain level of humility, right? And a regard for the welfare, another brother, right? We're coming out of a culture, a Babylonian culture that doesn't promote this. It promotes, you know, um, it just basically promotes a strong hatred, towards your fellow kinsman, against your fellow brother. Remember, this is a culture that perpetuates that same vibration that Cain had towards Abel, right? It's not a culture that promotes, kindness and gentleness and humbleness. You know what I'm saying? It's a culture that promotes, death and destruction, and it doesn't actually bring forth any life, right? So, that's pretty much the point. I kind of just wanted to, discuss this real quick. Don't make my mistake, and if you had made my mistake, just, ask the Lord for forgiveness. It's we make mistakes, right? But, just being aware of, you know, younger brothers, or, just brothers in general around them, and so on and so forth. And, just being more considerate and more mindful, right? So anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but, Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give our praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashmi Al Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.